Good morning. I'm Jim McLean, a member of the Kansas Oral History Project Board and a former reporter for Kansas newspapers and public radio stations. Today is August 4th, 2025, and we're here at Red Rocks, William Allen White's historic home in Emporia, to interview Tim Carpenter, an award-winning Statehouse reporter who now works for the Kansas Reflector. White, of course, was a Pulitzer Prize-winning editor of the Emporia Gazette. Called the spokesman for Middle America, White gained national fame for his editorials against the populists of the late 19th century and those in support of the progressive policies championed by President Teddy Roosevelt. Tim Carpenter is well known in his own right to Kansans who follow politics. He started covering the Kansas Statehouse in the mid-1980s as a reporter for the Topeka Bureau of United Press International. In 1988, he went to work for the Lawrence Journal-World. And then in 2004, he moved to the Topeka Capital Journal, where he anchored its Statehouse reporting team until 2020, when he joined the staff of the fledgling Reflector. The Reflector is a non-profit digital news organization which, in my opinion, currently provides the most comprehensive coverage of Kansas politics and state government. Newspapers across the state rely on its coverage. Our volunteer videographer is former Kansas Representative Dave Heineman. It was Dave's idea to do these interviews here at Red Rocks. This interview is part of the Kansas Oral History Project series exploring the contributions of reporters, editors, press secretaries, and others who informed the public about state and local policymaking during the late 20th century and early 21st century. The Kansas Oral History Project is a nonprofit corporation that collects and preserves oral histories of Kansans. The project is supported by donations from generous individuals and occasional grants. Welcome, Tim. Thanks a lot for doing this.
It's great to be here, and it's great to be in William Allen White's home.
Isn't it? Doesn't it just kind of, it's a perfect setting for a conversation about journalism, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say so. I feel a little bit out of place, like I shouldn't be here.
Yeah, I just walked around the place briefly, and you go into the dining room, and there are pictures of the three presidents who've had dinner with William Allen White here in this house.
We know what a giant he was in journalism. His little typewriters upstairs. It's
tiny
pretty incredible.
Yeah.
It's a different era, and it does show you that journalism does change.
Yeah.
Always.
Absolutely. And you know, he literally gained a spot on the national stage as an editor of the Emporia Gazette. You know, he wrote that "What's the Matter with Kansas?" that famous editorial where he was taking populists to task, and then he got to know presidents. He was very influential in progressive Republican politics for decades. So
and he took on the Klan, which
he did
in some circles would have been a really unpopular thing to do in rural America.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, he had the courage of his convictions for sure. So we're here and we're going to talk about your career in journalism. Now, you didn't grow up, you're not a native of Kansas. You grew up in Missouri on a farm, right? Just somewhere south of Kansas City?
That's right. Southeast of Kansas City, I grew up on. It was a dairy farm until I was a teenager, Holstein Dairy, and then we had beef cattle, and my parents have since passed away, but my brother and I are trying to save the family farm over there.
So in addition to your journalistic gig, you're still farming? I mean,
we have cattle and hay fields and just trying to put it all back together, rebuilding fences. It's all fundamental stuff.
Is that how you spend your weekends?
That's where I was yesterday, all day.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Building fences on the farm.
I was actually trying to figure out how to make a hay mower work.
Okay, all right. Well, so how does a farm kid from Missouri, end up as really one of the more noteworthy Kansas journalists of the last, I'd say, 20 years covering Kansas politics? Talk us through how that happened.
So, when I grew up in Greenwood, Missouri, we subscribed to Kansas City Star and Times, the morning and afternoon paper, Kansas City, and something
both the morning and afternoon.
Yeah, we got both papers, 2 papers a day, and on Sundays, my siblings and my parents, we'd each have a section of the paper and maybe pass it around to each other, sitting there on Sunday afternoon reading the paper. So we always read the news and was aware of things. And I went to Kansas State University to study agriculture. And it was kind of agribusiness, and I got to the point where I was in a agricultural market structures, a high-level econ course that had a calculus problem, this is how long ago it was, across 2 chalkboards. And I just threw up my hands and said, I'm not very good at math, I need to find something else to do. So I...
a common refrain from journalists, by the way.
Yeah. It is indeed. And for 1 year, I only took what I considered interesting classes at K-State, and one of them was an Intro to Journalism course, and the professor was Rob Daly, and he told me what journalism was all about.
What did he say?
He said that you go interview people, you take some notes, you come back and you write your first paragraph, that's called the lead, then you write some quotes and some background, and it's time to head to the local tavern. And I thought, you know, the first part sounds tricky, I'm incredibly shy, I don't know if I can actually do interviews, but if I can learn some of that stuff, I'll have a job after I get out of college. So I took all the journalism courses necessary, ran the Kansas State paper, the student paper. It was a 5-day-a-week paper at the time. The Collegian, very good paper, great people. And went on to my first job out of school was at United Press International in Topeka.
But you got your first taste of covering state government when you were at the Collegian. And you came to Topeka to cover, what, John Carlin's State of the State address?
So as a student, I don't know why I had this idea that it was important for a college student to go to the State of the State address by a governor, but I did. And so John Carlin gave it, and I think it's like probably 84 or 85, right in there.
About halfway through, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so I wrote a story about his State of the State address, and I've done it dozens of times since then, but it was the first taste of, and I thought it was interesting. You know, you got to remember, you go to the Statehouse and cover things, it's sort of like continuing education for the mind because the subject matter is so diverse. Every day can be different.
Absolutely.
And being a reporter, you can just sit around asking people nosy questions, and that seemed to question authority seemed like a good idea.
I like to have this discussion with everybody who comes through here because my first year at the State House was 1981, 5-6 years before you got there. But Governor John Carlin was governor at the time when I arrived. But I loved the place. I mean, it just seemed to me like it was its own small town village. You know, it had everything that a small town has: the diversity of population, the diversity of views. You know, it was kind of a self-contained place, and people, generally speaking, had their political differences. But it was a collegial place in those days. Is that your memory?
So I think there's definitely been a trend away from that collegiality.
Absolutely.
You can see that in Washington, D.C. Bob Dole used to talk about having great debates on the floor of the United States Senate and then going out to dinner with a Democrat that he had just went toe-to-toe with. And I think that's good for government. And that was good for Kansas government, too. There was an era in which that was certainly done. And I think now people are so combative that they don't even want to listen to other people's ideas. And that's to the detriment of all Kansans.
Yeah, there many times aren't real conversations going on there. People are on the floor, you know, essentially, spouting their talking points and then not listening. It's not really a conversation to the degree that it was, at least in my memory. And you've been there through that transition.
We have fewer robust, honest debates about legislation on the floor. A lot of people are just coerced to voting a certain way. Others are told to stay in your seat and don't debate this issue. Just keep quiet. The leadership has it all figured out. And so I think I think there's another element too here is that since 2020, all legislative House and Senate proceedings and all House and Senate committees have been live streamed and archived in video form. And I think actually it's good for Kansans to see how politicians are really working and what they're doing. But I think their behavior did change, and I think they say less controversial stuff, and also to the detriment of us.
Right. Now, so you graduate from K-State, and your first job out of college, right, was with United Press International?
Yeah. Yes, UPI in Topeka. They had a tiny little office near the Capitol where I was.
In the Jayhawk Hotel, right?
That's right. And then they had a bureau in the Statehouse with the Associated Press and all the other media. And my job, I just sat down at a desk and my beat was the state of Kansas in its entirety. And I thought, how in the world am I going to do this? But I had good teachers. Lori Lindenberger was the editor. She was and John Braden was in the Capitol with UPI. He was a good reporter. And so they were good teachers. And I used to go over to the Capitol before work every day and read the UPI wire. And that you might think today that's flipping through my phone or looking online.
Right.
Every UPI story printed out on a roll of paper.
Spool on the floor,
and it went down to the floor, and I'd just spool it back and read all the UPI wire copy from all over the country, all over the world, out of Washington, because I was desperate to learn how to be a real journalist. And I thought if I just kept reading, some of it would rub off.
Yeah, the clattering of those.
Yeah, it was the typewriter.
Yeah. That's one of my earliest memories when I got my first job at the radio station in Parsons, is the sound.
Yes.
It was pretty loud, too.
Yes, and so I think it was a great thing. And there was, UPI also had this, we send text to each other's now. They also had a method of sending text directly to a bureau or to all the bureaus across the country. And that was also another piece of paper that printed out every little message on your desk right next to you. And that rolled out onto the floor too.
Yeah, you used to have a spike on your desk with all that copy on your desk.
You had a way of talking to people. Say there's a big story and 3 states were working on it. You could communicate with all of those at the same time. And they also had shorthand, and I think it comes from the telegraph era where people had shorthand for writing some words, like "and" was "et." That's
Latin. Yeah.
A UPI person would write, they would write "cheers and regards," Tim, CHRS, ET, RGDS, and I do that today on emails.
Do you really?
Yes.
Yeah.
Unless I'm pissed off, and then I might not do that. This is my calm, sensible closure to a text or an email.
So you worked for UPI for a couple of years. Now UPI barely exists today. Certainly not. It doesn't exist in the way that it did then.
Yeah, my hiring had to be approved by the president of United Press International personally. That's how money-strapped they were, and they hung on for a couple of years, and then the wheels really started falling off. And I got laid off with a couple hundred other UPI reporters around the world, and they stayed for a bit longer, and I went to work for the Lawrence Journal-World.
Right.
And
you stayed there for quite a while.
I did. I stayed at the Lawrence Journal-World for about 16 years.
And you weren't their primary Statehouse reporter. That was Dave Toplicker.
Right. So at the Journal-World, what I did was I would parachute into the Capitol and write about higher education or K-12 schools or this issue or that. I was not there every day. I did have a bit of office space I shared with public radio, and so I had a place to sit down and throw my stuff while I ran around and tried to cover stories. So I was really a kind of a part-time presence there.
Remember how tiny that office was? There was KANU, which is now Kansas Public Radio. There was Channel 27 from Topeka, and there was the Journal World. All 3 of those desks. I mean, we were sitting about as close to one another then as we are now.
Yeah, you want to be friendly with people around you.
But Dave Toplicker, I mean, was the primary Statehouse reporter, right?
So I think for a time he was, for us at the Journal World, this is really not our wheelhouse,
Right.
So
higher education, certainly.
And so I tried to write about that because the University of Kansas was there. But other properties like the Capital Journal, Kansas City Star, Wichita Eagle, they would have more of an everyday presence year-round at the Statehouse.
That changed later when Mike Shields was the city editor, and they really emphasized Statehouse coverage for a while. But so you worked for the Journal for 16 years.
16 years, and I got a call from the Capital Journal asking if I would come over there and be an enterprise reporter. And I said,
so they didn't hire you necessarily as a Statehouse person?
No, it took a year when they lost a Statehouse reporter. I saw the writing on the wall and volunteered to go over there during the legislative session. So I went over to the Capital Journal in 2004, and 2005 I started covering every session.
You know who they lost in 2005, don't you?
You?
I left and Chris Grenz left,
Yeah, Grenz was there, right? I remember that.
Yeah.
And I worked with Chris Moon.
Oh, sure, I remember
who was
Chris.
quite a conservative person. Everybody thinks that journalists are a bunch of liberals, but he was extremely conservative, quite religious. I believe he's a minister now. And we would stand there, and these politicians would abuse us as a bunch of crazy liberals. And I would just, I just felt for him because I knew in his heart that wasn't him.
Right.
And they just didn't know what they were doing. They were just casting arrows at people without thinking about it.
Right.
And the reality is that reporters are liberal, conservative, and then there's this swath in the middle, and they're very much like the general population.
I agree with that. Most reporters, though, do have an idealistic bent. I mean, they're in it many times for a reason, that they really believe in brokering information to the public in an honest way. I mean,
So to say you believe in the First Amendment? That's pretty radical.
Well, they're mission-oriented, I think, for the most part. And
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, some come with a real purpose. My purpose is to tell people to write stories about the events that are going on so they don't have to take time out of their busy lives to go listen to a boring meeting that does have real news value in it. And so that's part of what I do. I kind of roll with the ideological shifts. and keep my politics to myself the best I can.
Yeah, that's been my observation. You've been very good about that. It's funny because when you first broke into covering the Statehouse, those were the days when literally the wire services and newspapers in particular found news value in just about anything that happened there. I mean, a committee meeting could generate an entire story in those days. A lot has changed since then, but you covered the minutia of state government then.
Yes, so imagine dozens of committee hearings a day. You might go to a committee meeting and there would be testimony to that committee and the bill not even get passed out by the committee, and you would write an item about it. And it's more of the minutia, the blow by blow, the day to day that has really, as the numbers of reporters in the Statehouse decline, has really been diminished. There's some people that they're going to wait until the House passes the bill and the Senate passes the bill, and maybe until the governor signs it to write their first story about it. That's just the squeeze that is on people and their time at the Statehouse. But there was an era before that where the Associated Press, UPI, and whatever newspapers would write more of the blow by blow.
Yeah, they were process oriented. They
there
wanted
was that, but it also told the reading public, this issue is going on.
Well,
Here's what's happening. This is in.
It's in the pipeline.
Yes, at the Capitol, and you might want to pay attention to it or not, instead of waiting until it's all over, said and done.
But also, it educated people a little bit about the process, I think, and people had a general understanding of how laws got made.
Yeah, they all had civics in school, but it is a bit of a mysterious process. They have some ridiculous rules that they still have today. And so it is a process you kind of got to learn the language of.
So you, again, as I noted earlier, you've been there for a long enough period of time. You've seen that change pretty dramatically. When you first broke into the press corps, it was a pretty robust operation. I don't, more than a dozen, 14, 15 reporters.
I tried to think about what it was like then. So the Topeka Capital Journal had two people. We shared an office with Harris News Service, which represented group of Western Kansas papers.
Right.
They had two people as well. I think the Topeka Capital Journal has tried to maintain a two-person bureau even today. Harris News Service is gone. Next door, in an office next door, was the Associated Press.
3 reporters and 4 during the session.
3 full-time reporters year-round. They're down to 1. And that one single AP reporter spends half the time collaborating with AP reporters in other states on major stories. So the AP component of it has been really diminished. Those reporters were always good, excellent reporters there. It's just the reality of the Associated Press.
And,
as people have dropped AP, and it's happened at newspapers. So look at the Kansas City Star and the Wichita Eagle. They had separate news staffs then, and maybe during the session, the combined Wichita Eagle and the Kansas City Star, now owned by McClatchy, they could send 5 reporters into the mix. And in the past few years, McClatchy, Eagle, and Star have shared 1 reporter. And so that is the diminishment of the Statehouse Press Corps that has had all kinds of ramifications.
well, one of the ramifications, as we just talked about, is you cover things more generally just because you can't do otherwise because you don't have the manpower.
You try to do the best you can that day. I think it's had 2 consequences. There's less blow-by-blow coverage, which can be useful, and it also builds a level of knowledge among the reporter on the issue.
And it builds a record, too.
Yes, it does. The second thing I think it's done, the diminishment of people, is that there's less investigative journalism by those reporters in the Statehouse because they just absolutely do not have the time to do it. And you draw a line under that and said, what are the consequences of that? And I say, politicians are getting away with more mischief than they used to.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true.
It's just going to happen.
Yeah. And so, but the exception to that, we talked about your time at the Capital Journal, and you were there for, what, 15, 16 years?
Yeah, so about 15 or 16, we could do the math. Yeah, so
and you
about
worked
the
with a lot
same.
of people. Chris Moon, you mentioned.
Yep.
Andy Marceau was a great reporter who you worked with. Jonathan Shorman. who went to the
Celia
Star.
Jopis-Jepson, who's at the Public Radio.
Right.
Worked with Sherman Smith, who's at the Reflector with me now. So some very talented reporters rolled through there. And then also just the people that I could observe working at the Star, the Eagle, that had a lot of experience and were really skilled too. And so I've always tried to read the content of other reporters there because I want to know what they know, but also there's ideas about how you cover stories and how you might approach something.
And you did your share of investigative work when you were at the Capitol Journal. I mean, you won several awards.
Mm-hmm.
The Burton Marvin Award, I mean, most people probably don't understand, don't know anything about it at all, but it's the award given annually by the William Allen White School of Journalism at KU, and it's quite prestigious among journalists. And
Mm-hmm.
you've won that several times.
A handful of times, yeah. So it's an investigative enterprise reporting award for really reporting that goes above and beyond.
Right.
And you know, it's the kind of story that might qualify for that was I wrote a story about the Attorney General at the time, Paul Morrison, who had an extramarital affair. It involved improper conduct in a public building at the courthouse in Johnson County, and he was subsequently elected Attorney General, and basically he resigned after the story came out.
That information wasn't available at the time of the election. It came after. Correct?
Yes, indeed. He had been Attorney General, and I think he served basically a year as Attorney General. And you know, I drew the line at what you're doing on the public's time in a public building should be shared with the public.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And you know, when my friends asked me, like, I'd interviewed Paul Morrison, I'd been to his house, I wrote a profile about him before he was elected, and you know, I just thought he was a quality attorney and somebody you might consider voting for. You know, you kind of got to set those personal things aside when you work on these stories. It was a pretty big blow to Democrats too, because Paul Morrison had been a Republican, recruited by Governor Sebelius to run as Attorney General, and I think in the future he could certainly run for governor himself. And it really took him out of action. And the Democrats in Kansas have always kind of had a short bench.
Right, absolutely. And I can't remember, I mean, he broke the mold in terms of winning the AG's office, because I can't remember another Democrat who served in that position in my time.
So another story might be an example of, I wrote a story about Governor Brownback's brother, who was basically was a menace back home in Parker, Kansas.
I remember that story.
And it took, I was all over southeast Kansas for 7 months in courthouses looking up his information about what he had done. He would drive his farm truck into a ditch and the sheriff would show up and basically say, you know, I'll call my brother. And you can take me into custody if you want, go right ahead. But I just think that there are just certain things about that, and it was a complete, comprehensive story about his conduct and how that touched the hand of the governor.
What made it a news story is the fact that he would use his brother's influence.
That's correct.
Right.
That's correct.
And by the way, just for people who are watching this interview, we're at Red Rocks, William Allen White's home, and there's some renovation work being done here, and so you might occasionally hear bumps and thumps and that kind of thing. It's just because there's construction work going on as we talk.
For a second there, I thought it was the ghost of William Allen White, but apparently it's not. I'm relieved.
They're fixing the place up.
Okay.
Yeah, but I wanted to talk to you about that because it's crucial when you talked about Paul Morrison and the fact that he had some admirable qualities, good public servant. And as a reporter, how do you feel when you know that you're writing something that could end his political career? I mean, you don't have any personal animus, but you feel duty-bound to report it, let the chips fall where they may. How difficult is that?
So, I don't take it lightly. These are people's lives that we're talking about here. I don't take it lightly, so you just keep working until you know with absolute certainty what you're writing is accurate.
That you've got the facts pinned down.
That's right.
Right.
And for the Brownback story, I left tons of material on the cutting room floor because I wasn't going to write anything about the governor's brother that wasn't told to me somebody who was there firsthand. I listened to a lot of secondhand stories, but I didn't include any of those in the story.
And how many of those people who you talked to were willing to be quoted by name?
A number of them were.
Because that's important too.
Yes, a number of and I used only name sourcing. I didn't use unattributed information. I interviewed people that their names never appeared nothing was attributed to an unnamed person.
So you can understand the context.
Yeah, it just broadens your horizons and your understanding of the issues at play.
So that you know that what you're reporting wasn't a one-off thing, that there was a pattern here.
One of the tests, yes, one of the tests you can give yourself is if you keep interviewing people about a subject, and you 3 times now somebody has told, very knowledgeable about this personally, and they've told you the same thing for the 3rd time, you can kind of accept it as like, yeah, I think I understand this point here.
Right.
So, I don't take it lightly. I tell people when I do interviews that I can be friendly, but I can't be your friend.
Right.
And I can't be the friend of people in politics per se. I don't put yard signs in my yard. I don't put bumper stickers on the car. I vote, and my votes are my personal choice.
You don't make campaign contributions?
No, of course
can't.
not. Yes, of course not. And so I think you kind of keep an arm's length. The other thing is, I think I've learned over the years to not take a lot of this personally. I have my own ideas about what good government is. I have my ideas about what ag policy should be, water policy, and the like. But you kind of set that aside and write about what people are saying. It's impossible to not have some subjective element come into your reporting because you are a product of your experiences. Mm-hmm. I grew up on a farm. I know what that's like. I know what it's like to have the farm shut down due to economics. We sold the dairy herd and that was over, something my grandfather created. That's hard, but it's a good lesson to have. You understand Kansas agriculture a little bit better from that experience.
You're getting into some of the nuance, which I think is really important to understand, because let's just talk a little bit about the difference between objectivity. People say reporters are quote unquote objective. Well, I think we both would say that that isn't necessarily the case. Objectivity is a pretty high bar. But what we're striving for is balance in a story and understanding the context and not putting things that are, out of context. I mean, and really reporting accurately, and then having the editors who oversee your work, question you about, do you have the facts down,
sure,
that kind of thing.
Yes, I think you want to have an array of voices in your stories that sort of like cover the landscape. That's what your goal is.
Right.
There's sometimes where some slice of that pie doesn't want to talk to you. You just have to say that out loud in your story that yes, the Senate president, who a bunch of people are complaining about, wouldn't talk about the subject matter for this story.
Right.
And there's really nothing you can do. I don't have the power to arm twist people into sitting down and talking to me. So you just need to say that out loud. I think everybody, maybe it's an objective, subjective thing, and people are going to be subjective about what they think the truth is and what the truth isn't. And I think there was a time when I started in journalism where people were much more apt to read a story and accept this piece, that voice, this idea, this proposal as just what was in the landscape of the subject. And now today, we've evolved into something that's quite different. And people want echo chambers. And if people are patting the reader on the back and saying, if the writer is just saying exactly what Jim McLean wants to hear, then they view that as truth. Mm-hmm. And it's become a distortion. It's very problematic. It's fractured the ability to reporters to present things because it's so easy now for a politician to say, that's just not true. That's a bunch of baloney.
Fake news.
Yeah, Governor Brownback, I remember telling me at a news conference, I asked him about something, he goes, "Oh, Tim, that's more fake news." So all politicians at all levels have adopted this strategy to demonize reporters when people are writing uncomfortable things.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I remember when Jeff Collier ascended to the governor's office when Governor Brownback went to serve in the first Trump administration. Mm-hmm. And I remember Medicaid expansion was a big story then, as it is today. I mean, but that was several years ago. But I remember asking Governor Collier about it several times, about Medicaid expansion. And his response would always be, well, Kansans don't support it. And then I would say, well, actually, all the polling suggests they do, by 60, 70%. And he would just look at me and repeat the fact that, no, he'd just look at me and say, Kansans don't support it, in the face. So here's my question to you as a reporter. How do you communicate to the reader that the response you've gotten from the governor of Kansas is on its face inaccurate.
But you could just say Governor Collier insists that, in his view, Kansans don't support Medicaid expansion.
Even
And then you could have a quote from him to get him on the record. Here's a quote: Medicaid expansion is unpopular, period. And then you can go to the Fort Hays State University study that has relentlessly, year to year, documented how Kansans broadly support Medicaid expansion. And you would just put that in there, put the numbers in there, talk to one of the pollsters if you want to, and put their comment in there about what their interpretation of those numbers are. So, I can remember the first time that politicians started flat out calling other politicians liars. It was a word that I just resisted and would try very hard not to put in a story, because lying means you know the truth and you're saying something different on purpose. Having a different opinion and a different view doesn't make you a liar. And so we've cast about with this lying word and trust and truth, and it's become mangled so badly that I think readers need to read more broadly. And I think that's a problem. And you think that a journalist is not telling you the truth, but really they're just reciting what people are saying. It may not be what you want the only story theme to be, but there's a lot of truth in what's being written and said.
Well, that's true certainly for the publication you work for, even though some people believe the Reflector is a liberal mouthpiece.
So
did you come up against that
Let me
much?
tell you, yeah. Let me just say this. I worked at the Lawrence Journal World in a pretty moderate community with a very conservative publisher. Topeka Capital Journal, kind of more of a Republican town, with a shifting centrist to Republican editorial policy.
But a fairly conservative paper. Dolph Simons at the Journal World, and certainly
Extremely
the Stoppers.
conservative. All things that begin with a big R are good, Republican. So what I'm saying is I've dealt with being a reporter, going out in the community and have people enraged about an editorial that was written, and I get to answer the questions about it. And so I've worked in places where they had conservative editorials and less conservative editorials, and then in the Kansas Reflector, we have 4 reporters and 1 opinion writer. And I would say that opinion writer is left of center.
Absolutely, I would agree.
And so, unfortunately, people don't make the proper distinguishment between things that say opinion and news.
Well, they never have, and the Wall Street Journal is a good example of that too. Its editorial page is what it is, but the news reporting, it doesn't have the same conservative, business-oriented slant necessarily as the editorial page.
Until you've worked in a newsroom and seen the intense firewall that existed between the newsroom and the publisher's office.
And the advertising department.
Right? I don't answer to advertising. The owners own the paper. I understand they would get the final say, but I'm going to work straight ahead and do the news stories as straight as I can until I'm told not to. And 99.999% of the time, I got no static about what I was writing. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
I write what I think is appropriate, and if somebody at this level up here says I can't, then I understand that. They own the property. I also get to decide whether I continue working there or not.
Exactly. I remember I only had that kind of pressure applied to me a few times in my career, and one of them when I was reporting on West Star at the time, and David Whittig, who was the CEO at the time, and the coverage, David Whittig perceived the coverage as critical, but again, it was just reporting what was actually happening in terms of Wall Street and everything else. And I got a call from the publisher who said they had invited Mr. Whittig over to an editorial board meeting, and they had reserved the last 15 minutes of the meeting so he could express his grievances about me. And I needed to attend the meeting and listen and respond. And it turns out, ironically, that he complained about something, some reporting on his golden parachute should he decide to leave the company. And the story he was complaining about was actually a Lawrence Journal World story, not my story.
Excellent.
So I
LJW.
dodged that bullet. But you're right.
It's another example of how you have to being thick-skinned, and as a reporter, you're gonna get praised and you're gonna get criticized. Right. There's going to be people that act stupid and crazy. I was at a Republican National Convention in Minnesota, and a delegate kicked my laptop. at a Bob Dole event where Danforth and others were there to praise Bob Dole, and I leaned my laptop against the wall while I took notes, and he realized I was a reporter and kicked my laptop. I needed that worse than I needed water to drink that day.
Yeah, right.
But there was another example. I wrote a story about Congressman Jim Ryan living in Washington. He bought a house in D.C. We're talking about $1 million properties here for below market rate. And it was really about how this was kind of an insider deal and with political undertones about how he got a below market house in D.C. So I just wrote this very expansive story about it. 2 months later, I'm sitting in the newsroom and somebody says, hey, they want you in the conference room. So I walk in there, Congressman Ryan, a couple of his staff, the whole editorial board of the Topeka Capital Journal are sitting there. And he has come and he has an audience to complain about this story. I hadn't read it in 2 months. And so he starts criticizing the story. And you could wilt under that environment, I guess. But I finally just asked, does somebody have a copy of the paper? And I just needed to refresh my memory. This was a story that was 3,000 words. It was a massive story. In the end,
As many of yours are.
nothing was wrong with that story. Nothing. Didn't like the tone.
Boy, I've heard that a
Tone,
million times.
word choice.
Yes.
Would have been great if you hadn't written this story at all,
Right.
But just wanted to go right over my top. Congressman Ryan didn't give me a buzz. I've published my cell phone number in the newspaper and online for 20 years. It's easy to pick up the phone and tell me, and I've made many mistakes as a journalist. People call me and tell me, and I appreciate that.
You have to own up to
the
them.
sooner the better.
Absolutely. It's
I want to fix what's wrong. And there's a lot of people that have jobs and they go have a lousy day at work and they're a painter, they're a house painter, and oops, it's the wrong color. You just come back the next day and fix it. Well, in journalism, you make a mistake in the newspaper, people let you hear about it, and tomorrow they run a correction. Tim had a terrible day at work yesterday, and here's what happened.
Not quite that explicit, but yeah.
I know,
yeah.
but that's the idea,
Yeah.
that people, the world knows, and it's in the permanent record
You made a
of
mistake.
when I screwed up.
I remember one time writing a column about Governor Brownback. It's when he was running for the Senate against Jill Docking, and there were allegations that he, I think it was an ad he produced, was anti-Semitic because Jill Sadowski Docking
Correct.
was Jewish.
Yes, I remember that.
And so I wrote this column, and he called me. To his credit, he called me directly and said, "This, what you wrote here, is inaccurate." So ran a correction the next day. That's just what you have to do. Again, it was a column, not a news story. So.
Yeah.
But in any event, you're exactly, I want to take you back a little bit because when you talked about, I want to go back to the Medicaid expansion example, and you talked about using the Fort Hays State Kansas Speaks poll. Because I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but that's very interesting because the organizations that support Medicaid expansion have also done numerous polls, right? But you chose the one done by a public entity and not the ones done by the people who are advocating for the change. Because why?
Well, polls can be distorted by the way you ask the question, by the way you collate the answers. And so you have to have a certain level of skepticism about polling in general.
Particularly if it's released by the organization that's pushing for the policy change.
Because they're called push polls, and they ask questions in a way to elicit a certain answer. And I think, I think to a degree, I'm not a huge fan of polling these days because I think some of the polling quality has declined.
It's gotten very much harder to do.
In part because it used to be everybody had a landline phone. Correct. You would just call those, people would pick up and they would get surveyed over the phone. But now everybody has cell phones. I think they've tried to compensate for that. It's really hard to get that real cross-section of society. And so I think that's problematic, and I think when you do, these days, when pollsters interview people, I'm not sure people are quite honest.
Right.
They might say, yeah, I'm not voting for Trump, or I am voting for Trump, or I'm going to vote for Governor Kelly, or I'm going to vote for Chris Kobach or Derek Schmidt. I just don't think they're as honest as they might once were.
They're willfully gaming
Maybe
the
they're
polls.
jaded or something. I don't know.
I think that's
but
probably
I think I'm very cautious of polling, particularly when you want to talk about 1 or 2 percentage points. I don't think they have any idea
I would agree with that, but when you have a poll that says 70% of people support something, it's generally speaking.
Then you can confidently say a majority of Kansas support X.
Correct.
And the poll is there. Medicaid expansion to more lower income people, Kansans support it. Kansans want not medicinal marijuana, a majority want recreational marijuana.
Let me ask you this then, because you bring up another interesting point as a reporter that you have to grapple with. How do you explain to people who will ask you, Medicaid expansion, 70% support, recreational marijuana, similar support. How can something have that broad support and get nowhere in the Statehouse? Mechanically, how does that happen?
Yes, so the leadership of the House and Senate says no, and they will block bills from coming out of committee or getting heard on the House or Senate floor.
But if that many Kansans support it, why don't they suffer any consequence for that?
Because, well, they perhaps should. But, not enough people read about this. Not enough people make the connection that Medicaid expansion was blocked by House Speaker Dan Hawkins, or medicinal marijuana was blocked by Senate President Ty Masterson. They just don't make those connections, perhaps. And the world keeps revolving, whether or not we have those things or not.
Well,
but yeah, popular, but the world doesn't come to a crashing close if those reforms don't occur.
I think what the way a political scientist would explain that is that yes, people support those issues, but they're not the issues that they primarily go to vote on. I mean, there are other issues that they care a lot more about.
Good schools. They want the local hospital. They want law enforcement to come when they call 911. They want safe highways to drive on. These are the things that elections are won and lost on.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Kansas Reflector, because that's where you work now.
Yes.
And you've been there for how many years now?
5 years, just had our 5-year anniversary.
And you started, you were one of the initial hires, weren't you, when they
Yeah, they
staffed up?
hired Sherman Smith to be the editor. And there's 39 of these Statehouse bureaus across the country. We're one of 39. There's a parent nonprofit in North Carolina called State's Newsroom. They aggregate all this statewide copy, put it on a website. They have a handful of Washington, D.C. reporters. They cover the White House. They have editors on both coasts. Everybody's wondering when they're going to open the Hawaii bureau because the applications for that will be off the charts. But they don't. They're in 39 states because they're not in states that have very robust state independent news coverage, Texas, California, and the like. And so these 39 bureaus operate independently, cover the State House, politics, and public policy, with not a whole heck of a lot of intervention from the bureau, the office in North Carolina, because you can imagine they just have a small enough staff, they can't micromanage much of anything. So we're pretty independent operation here in Kansas and write the stories that we think are important. Some are teeth rattling and get a lot of attention, and some of the things we think are important are less so. But we get to decide what we think is important news.
Now, again, I think that the Reflector does a fantastic job, particularly in the absence of the press corps as it used to exist with so much competition and so forth. I mean, you really are now, you have probably the biggest bureau at the Statehouse of any publication, right?
That's true.
And now the wire services, as you mentioned, UPI is essentially gone.
Yeah.
Fewer and fewer papers depend on the AP because they can't afford it, because smaller circulations, everything else. So the Reflector and the Kansas News Service, a lot of the copy that's generated by both ends up in newspapers across the state.
Yeah, because
you're a quasi-wire service.
Across the spectrum of State's Newsroom and all of these Statehouse bureaus, an underlying benefit to the public is that all content is free. So you can go to the Kansas Reflector website today, there's no paywall, there's no ads, and you can go and any journalistic entity can republish our copy for free, and you can see 25 to 30 Kansas newspapers choose what stories they want to publish, and they print them in their papers. And our copy goes into the Midwest, and it's on a national website. If you write a pretty decent story, it's going to go on a national website. So there's a national readership.
Just like the wire service.
That's right. And so when you can bring together these kind of reporting resources, you can make a big dent in Statehouse reporting.
Now, as you mentioned earlier, the Reflector has a reputation for being a little left of center, primarily, I think, because of Clay Wirestone, your editorial. He's a great editorial writer, and I think he really he makes powerful points. But how do you respond to the notion that because it's in today's politics, it's just you're just mainstream liberal media.
Well, I would try to explain the difference between a news story and an opinion editorial.
Right.
And there's a lot of guest columns on there too that Clay doesn't write.
Right.
We have voices from all over Kansas, and some of those are probably in a broader range of the political spectrum. I can't defend the opinion stuff. I don't.
But what about State's news service generally, and where the money comes from? Is there any kind of ideological bent to that?
I have no contact with fundraising at all. The Kansas Reflector people do go out in communities. We've probably done 25 or 30, you could call them town halls, but basically we show up and talk about, people ask us a bunch of political questions. We've been in Emporia, we've been all over the state, and basically we talk about politics. People ask us a bunch of questions, and we have a coffee or a beer sometimes, and we talk about the things that people are interested in. Sometimes 20 people come, sometimes 100 people come. And so we try to share that way. And that is in part, there's a fundraising element to that. I'm sure people who come to that are more generous with their money. And so there is fundraising that occurs in Kansas, but State's Newsroom, the parent nonprofit, really takes the thrust of fundraising away from us. And if you're a substantive donor, I think the metric is $1,000. They'll publish your name online. There's a list.
So people can review that list.
You can go see, there's organizations, I think there's foundations, and there's trusts, and there's people, and some are wealthy, some are not, and there's, I think one of the donors is a labor union, for example. So there's all kinds of donors. It's just a mishmash of people, and some of them maybe have a certain political bent, but others just understand the absolute value of having reporters looking over the shoulder of politicians in the Capitol.
But do you feel in today's environment, when you go into the Capitol, I mean, I know the Reflector has had its differences with some of the legislative leadership. I mean, do you feel like they give you an honest shake? Do you feel like they have an opinion about?
Well, they definitely have an opinion about what they think I am.
Or the publication generally.
Yes, and that they'll apply that to me, and snarky remarks, whatever, but I can just blow that stuff off.
Well, Bob Dole used to call the Hutch News the Pravda of the plain.
Well, there's people who refer to Lawrence as the Socialist Republic of Lawrence.
That's right.
So, and I came from Lawrence. I'm in the Capitol from Lawrence, and there's people that don't know much about Lawrence, which in reality is more conservative than what people give it credit for.
And it's in the 1st Congressional District now.
It is now. It used to, and so I feel I have so much in common with the people of Dodge City, Kansas, because the 1st District arcs around and grabs my house in Lawrence and then goes away. And that was just all gerrymandering, a bunch of stuff. But I'm pretty sure I can bring a steer from the Missouri farm and plunk it down in my backyard, and I will feel one with the feedlots of Western Kansas.
Well, let me ask you this, because I remember a time when I was starting up the KHI news service at the Kansas Health Institute. You came to me, and you were pretty skeptical about whether that was a legitimate news operation or whether there was an ideological bent, because again, we were a nonprofit, and most of the funding came from the Kansas Health Foundation, and I think that was appropriate at the time. I welcomed those questions, just like you welcome, and what I said then is what I think you're saying now is the work just has to stand on its own.
Yeah, it's healthy skepticism to wonder about.
Absolutely.
Are you a puppet being pulled in different directions? But the work should speak for itself.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, a lot of politicians don't spend their free time reading all of our stories. They just believe what they want to believe without looking at the facts. People read headlines. Just you and I read headlines sometimes, and people read a headline and they don't even read the content and draw a conclusion from it. So that's just that's an occupational hazard.
That's the age-old story too, but I think it's gotten.
So I've had to defend my work in front of all kinds of political right and left people. So,
but the bottom line is, you feel no pressure from the funding entity on a daily basis in terms of what you cover, what you don't cover, how you cover it.
I've had in 5 years maybe let's just say fewer than 10 conversations with an editor at the parent nonprofit in 5 years.
Okay.
And that was just editing stories to try to make major stories to try to make them better. I've met the leadership of the entity. They stopped by our office in Topeka shortly after we started. I met them, shook their hand, sat down in a chair and had a chat. So as far as having somebody with a microscope on the Kansas Reflector every day, that's not happening.
So how big is your audience? Do you have any idea?
So
Newspapers, you talk about their circulation.
yeah,
Do you have a sense?
I'm not very good at some of these numbers, but the readership has increased substantially every year. Substantially.
Tens of thousands of people read it?
I think, I'm thinking that in February of 2025, there was more than 1 million readers of the Kansas Reflector.
Well, that's a substantial audience in a state the size of Kansas, for sure.
Yes.
Okay.
But it's out on social media. One of the things that changed about journalism in my time is that social media is a much greater presence, so people can get access to our copy through TikTok and X and
Right.
Facebook and all that.
And as we've discussed, you have straight news coverage, you have editorial, and you also have a podcast.
Yeah, we have a podcast, and it's sort of like I
Just
sit
like
down with
the-
political and policy people, and we kind of have a conversation about an issue. And one of the advantages of it is it helps build relationships with politicians, a thing that I think is very important for a reporter and has been minimized as politicians try to be standoffish. They don't want to engage in interviews like they used to. Why answer difficult questions of a reporter when I can just send a statement to them and not
Into
get
the
into
email
it?
box of people who you know
But
already
so if I
support
can
you,
sit
yeah.
down with a politician, I think I can show them in my questioning and in my sensitivity to issues that I can be a reporter they can trust. And so I like the podcast interviews for that reason. It builds relationships. Because you can't be part of a massive organization like the state of Kansas and not have things go wrong. And things go wrong terribly. I mean, to a certain degree, foster care, lives are at stake. So when those inevitable things happen, it would be good if I'm the Senate president to have a relationship with a reporter and maybe pick up the phone and have a conversation about this. I think you need to know X. I think you need to know Y as you go about reporting the story. So relationships matter. And the other thing about it is I can sit down and I'll write a story about a podcast interview that's about this long, and I can only put so much in. But in a 25-minute conversation, you can say so much more.
Right.
And so, and it's unedited by us. We're not cutting it up and doing a bunch of fancy editing and say, gotcha there. It's just the conversation. If I had a sneezing fit or something in an interview, we'd
Might
cut
edit
that out.
Right, of course.
You know, I think Jeff Collier was doing one when he was governor, and he was on a serious coughing jag. The guy who painted the mural of Brown v. Board in the Capitol, I was sitting there with a woman who went to school back in that era, and the artist, and basically the artist got elements of his own mural backwards. It's in the Capitol. And he got corrected, and we said, okay, let's just stop for a second. I'm going to ask that question again.
Sure.
Yeah, and so it's just kind of like, we're not here to, embarrass an artist about a painting he
No,
made.
you just want the right information to get out to the public, yeah.
And it's not like I'm sanitizing anything. If I was doing an interview with the governor, that's probably something I might not do.
Exactly.
But I want to be polite, you know.
And speaking of relationships, I mean, kind of to close this down, looking back over your long career, I mean, you've been there a lot. I mean, you and John Hanna of the AP, I mean, have probably been there the longest of the current crop of reporters.
Started about
right?
the same time, I think.
Right,
yeah,
okay.
as reporters.
So as you look back, speaking of relationships, is there anyone who stands out in your memory, not in terms of necessarily the relationship to you, but somebody who stands out as somebody who you thought a lot of in terms of their ability to navigate the policy process, their leadership abilities, their veracity, their honesty, their relationship with the media? Anybody who stands out in your time at the Statehouse?
So one of the, Governor Collier was governor for basically a year, but Mark Parkinson replaced Kathleen Sebelius when she went to work in the Obama administration.
Yeah, Mark Parkinson, who had been the chair of the state Republican Party.
That's right.
He became a Democrat to run as Sebelius.
He either figured out the right party to get into, or he was a turncoat. I don't
Right.
really know.
And so when Kathleen went to the
to
Obama administration,
Washington,
he took over.
Mark Parkinson was lieutenant governor and became governor. He was exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
And he's, as far as I know, the only person who's given a State of the State address with no notes. I was asked to come into a House Democratic caucus meeting one time, and they said the governor's coming. So I sat down in the back to see what he had to say. And one of the things he did was he pointed at me and said, I'm here, I want all of you to know this. You should all be using your campaign money to subscribe to as many newspapers as you can, because we need them. We need them badly. And I liked that. But I liked his professionalism, his thought process. And so I was very impressed by that. There's a Republican, Steve Morris, was Senate President.
Oh, wow.
And it was a different time. It was less combative. He might have been considered a moderate Republican, but every Friday you could just go down to his office and ask him anything.
Right.
And that doesn't happen now. And so you're closed off. And every Friday you could go down there and just ask about what's happening next week or what happened yesterday, and you could have a conversation about it. And I think that kind of openness and that leadership style, I think it's good for Kansans, because you could clarify the statement that was made. You could ask that follow-up question. And when you close yourself off as a politician, you really shouldn't complain about the coverage if you're not going to participate in the coverage.
Yeah,
You
Steve
know?
Morris from Hugoton, who was the
Yeah.
Senate President and who one of 6, I think, maybe more moderate Republicans who were taken out.
Right. In 2012 era, Governor Brownback decided the Senate wasn't conservative enough, and he recruited and funded and messaged some House members, and they succeeded in taking out a bunch of so-called moderate Republicans.
If I can be permitted to say this, my wife, Deb Miller, who was Secretary of Transportation for
Yes.
several years, I think shares your opinion of Mark Parkinson. She really thought he did a magnificent job, leading the state during his time.
Yes, I think he was exceptional. There's other good governors, and I've often thought that the job of governor is incredibly difficult, incredibly hard. To be a United States Senator, U.S. House member, you can go to D.C. and nobody knows what you're doing. You could go to your committee meetings or not. But the governor is on at all times. When Governor Brownback he was a U.S. Senator, became governor.
Right.
He did this. It's a tradition. Statehouse reporters can go interview an incoming governor in December before they take office. And I mentioned to him, I said, Governor-elect, you're going to be surprised at the scrutiny you're under. And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, Governor, you could go out on the lawn of the U.S. Capitol and plant 40 trees, and nobody is going to come over and say, Congressman, you're planting trees. Where are the TV cameras? We should do interviews. But you could go, as governor, you could go wander around the Capitol with a coffee cup in your hand.
Which he did, teacup.
He did. You might end up with a TV camera in your face. If you went out and sat on a park bench outside, people would come and interview you. It's just a totally different thing. You're on, there's a lot of decisions you have to make. It's a very tricky job.
Yeah.
And it always makes me wonder when people sign up, a lot of people won't sign up to run for governor. My first question is, have you lost your mind?
Yeah, why do you think you want to do this?
Like,
yeah.
are you sure?
It's funny, my mind goes back to Bill Graves. Just a quick story here. I worked for a time for Congressman Slattery, and he ran for governor against Bill Graves, and Bill Graves won handily. So I was part of the Slattery campaign. I get a job for a business publication and I get subsumed into the Topeka Capital Journal. At one point, they want to send me back to the Capitol to be a reporter. I say, okay, I'd love to do that, but there might be a small problem here. I need to go talk to the governor to see if he's okay with it, because I literally participated in the campaign against him. He couldn't have been nicer. Couldn't have been nicer, because I'd covered him for years before when he was Secretary of State, and he was great about it.
It speaks well of Bill Graves.
It speaks very well of Bill Graves. He wasn't threatened
that he
by
wouldn't
it.
have that animus. Me personally, I know exactly what you're talking about, because if I did public relations and then thought about going back into news, I may never do PR, and I never have.
I know.
Because I would be anxious about that crossing that street, that line back and forth. I am a dinosaur. I mean, I've been a news reporter professionally for 39 years.
No, I'm the exception.
And
probably shouldn't have happened.
many of my peers over the years have gone on to other and better things in public relations.
But I
and
saw
what
the
have
light.
you.
I wanted to come back. I saw the power of journalism. I thought the power was on the other side. It isn't. At least it wasn't. It may be now. But I just think I wanted to say that in the context of people who I look on, saying, that he he knew who he was. He was comfortable in his own skin. He was a nice person, and I think that, you know, I just remember him and being amazed that he could be that sanguine about it. But he was.
We all know that power corrupts, and some people get in leadership, even in the legislature, and they use that title to settle old scores. And it's dangerous, it's bad public policy, it's a gigantic waste of time, and it's not what you were elected to do.
Yeah. Well, Tim, this has been a lot of fun. It's great talking to you. You've been a good, solid reporter for a long period of time. I hope you continue for several more years at the Kansas Reflector, because the state needs it now more than ever.
It's my pleasure. I wouldn't miss an opportunity to sit down and talk about journalism and wave my arms around a little bit and get excited.
Yeah. Thanks again.
Sure.